Hey guys, my name is Nick and welcome back to the channel, and in today's video I want to have a little chat about the recent rules teasers that we've had from Games Workshop over the last week, where we're talking Overwatch, lookouts, and just a general discussion about whether melee armies are going to be the new hotness of 9th edition. Let's get straight into the video. So I'm going to kick this video off with the drama of the week, drama alert, fire Overwatch. So Overwatch at the moment is a no penalty, easy to do, point and click, roll extra dice at your opponent as they charge into you. It's a no-brainer, you haven't got to think about it. Anyone who charges, providing they don't make it, you can just keep on firing at will. So taking a look at the picture I've got up at the moment, because I really want to focus these kind of conversations in and around my forces that I predominantly use. So in this particular video I want to talk about Tzeentch forces, or Tzeentch demons, because knights really don't get overly impacted too much about some of these new rules with defensible and things like that we'll cover in a second. So the thing we need to talk about with the change of 9th edition then is that Overwatch is now a stratagem worth 1 command point. Use this stratagem after an enemy unit has declared a charge against one or more units from your army. One of the units that was chosen as the target of that charge can fire Overwatch before the charge roll is made. So previously, just fire at will, any unit, any charges, everyone gets Overwatch. Now it is a core stratagem from the main rulebook. There will be some exceptions, and that has been commented on already. And a couple of those I'll just put up for a second now. This particular one will overrule that Overwatch, costing you a stratagem because it is an earnable battle trait in the Crusade way of playing. So permanently granting them free and improved Overwatch at all times. So this is going to be an interesting one when it comes to crusading. I don't believe this is going to be in regular match play, but something similar will come along that will deal with that in regular games. As it says here, free Overwatch attacks like this are few and far between, and they're worth seeking out because they don't prevent you from using the stratagem in the same phase, and therefore costing you valuable resources in your command points. And in one of the comments below some of these stratagem pictures that we get to see, it says, in general, attackers will want to carefully choose their order of their charges to coax other players into using Overwatch prematurely, and defenders will need to consider whether they should withhold their Overwatch fire for later. You may find some units or circumstances granting Overwatch without the need for a stratagem, and these will be very valuable indeed. So I know a lot of Tau players have already started complaining across the internet for the last week, throwing their toys out of the pram or onto eBay, whichever comes quicker, because their biggest key was creating this castle, an impenetrable Overwatch castle with overlapping fire. So once you got shot off the board and you finally got into a bit of combat, they just continued to shoot you anyway, and they've all got a bit salty about it. I suspect Tau will still have something to boost them in this area of the game. So just by way of a pictorial representation on the screen here, I've got an Armiger Knight buddied up with a Dreadnought, facing off against 2 squads of 3 Screamers. In 8th edition, and I was the Screamer player here, I would charge both units quite happily, but I would face Overwatch from both the Knight and the Dreadnought, regardless of whether I made combat or not. With 9th edition coming along, I will still charge both units, for example, but the opponent will have to choose either to not fire Overwatch or spend 1 command point on either the Knight or the Dreadnought to shoot at one of those charging units. They will not be able to Overwatch both. So historically what would traditionally happen then is you'd probably whiff one of the charges, but they would have already been shot at, probably lost at least 1 if not 2 models on the way in, and get no benefit from it, whereas the other unit will probably survive the Overwatch, get into combat, and you've kind of lost models for no gameplay or no gain on your side here. Now you are making your opponent choose extra wisely when it comes to being charged, and I think that makes a very tactical and difficult decision. Now although you are burning up CPs to make this Overwatch, remember that you do get, in the command phase of every turn now, or every battle round, every one of your rounds, you will regenerate 1 CP. So you will always have something up your sleeve if you wanted to use this stratagem all the way through to the end of the game. So going back to that comment that was in the text earlier about forcing your opponent to make a strategically more viable or more difficult decision. So here I've got a couple of units that I might want to charge this Dreadnought with. I've got my unit of Screamers and I've got a unit of Pink Horrors backed up there with a Herald. Traditionally, what you would do is probably charge with your chaff unit, ones that you don't mind potentially getting shot, and then you want to try and tag that Dreadnought up, and then you can send the other units in without fear of being overwatched. So I'd send the Pink Horrors in, hope they make combat, and then send the Screamers in. Now what I'll be doing is declaring the charges with both units, and then the Dreadnought player now has to pick and choose who he wants to overwatch, because one of them is going to get in and one of them is going to get shot. If you whiff both charges, 8th edition, they would have still both been shot. But now with 9th edition, only one of these targets will be shootable. The character here would not be shootable. We'll get to that in a minute. That wouldn't be a viable target. We'll cover that with the new Lookout Sir rules. One of the other bits of information we had then was on defensible. Now I did a video a little while ago, last week I believe, talking about some of the new traits that you apply to your terrain. Defensible was one of them, and I did guess correctly. I'm going to take my doff my hat to myself. I did correctly guess that defensible will probably give you an Overwatch bonus, but actually it's given you 2, so I got it half right. So infantry units, that is a key here, can hold steady or set to defend a defensible piece of terrain if no enemy is within the engagement range. Hold steady, your Overwatch, you still have to going to have to activate your stratagem for 1 command point, but your Overwatch attacks will now hit on a 5+, or you can set to defend. So perhaps you don't have a ranged weapon or any good weapons at all. You might want to go for a set to defend. So you can't fire Overwatch, but you add 1 to the hit roll in the next fight phase. So when the opposing enemy unit charges into your lines, you're now going to be on +1 to hit in that subsequent fight phase. So yeah, an interesting choice again for the defenders, both of which are pretty cool, especially if you've got a strong melee unit that doesn't do a lot of shooting, or you're facing a particularly tough unit and so on, where hitting on 5s and then potentially winning on 5s and 6s is going to be a lot of dice for maybe a lack of result. So set to defend now gives you that bonus option here to give them a kicking in combat. Of course, if there are multiple charges going on at the same time, the charging unit would always fight first, but you could strategically intervene. I know that stratagem is still remaining. They have told us that as one of the core rules. So for 2 CP you can still intervene. So again, you are forcing far more tactical choices here, whereas you maybe before you would just go, yep, I've charged, I'll pick probably the stronger units or the ones that are more tactically savvy to do their attacks first, keeping an eye on those CP counts from your opponent to see if they're going to interrupt. But if they're in a defensible position, which you might not have considered an attack you might have wanted to go with first, now that you're going to be +1 to being hit, you might think that a bit more carefully in the future. The next thing I want to talk about then is Lookout Sir, which is basically your character targeting. So previously we would have this rule where you couldn't shoot at a character with a certain wounds characteristic with a ranged weapon if it wasn't the nearest unit that was visible. Now there's been a few extra bits and pieces here bolted into this to make that a bit more streamlined, a little bit more definitive, let's say. So you now cannot target a character that has 9 wounds or less. So Demon Princes are still safe. Most Space Marine characters are still safe, for example. Big monsters, less so. You cannot target them with a ranged weapon while it is within 3 inches of any other vehicle or monster friendly to that side, or while it's within 3 inches of any other friendly units that have 3 or more models. 3 or more models is now something a bit new. So if you had a single model ahead of a character before, you couldn't shoot it. In 9th edition, that's now going to be a viable target to that shooting unit. And again, as before, this was an FAQ'd piece here. Ignore any other enemy character models with a wounds characteristic of 9 or less when determining if the target is closest to the firing model. So characters can't block other characters is what came out of, I think it was a Nova Open mission where someone was running like 15 assassins or something, and one of those assassins you can't hit on anything less than a 6, so that was being used to screen all your other characters. So I believe that's where the adjustment came during 8th edition. Now, this is now defined in 9th. So I've got a couple of examples on how this looks. The first example I've got here is an Exalted Flamer stood next to a Mutolith Vortex Beast fighting on the same side. The Flamer is a character, is under 9 wounds. The Mutolith is a monster. It is the nearest unit to the Dreadnought, therefore the Flamer cannot be shot. The next example then is a unit of 3 or more models. I've got a unit of 3 pink horrors here, stood in front of that Flamer again. The Flamer is therefore not a viable character target. But with the new rules, if it is less than 3 models in the unit and isn't a vehicle or a monster, the character is a viable target. So in this case, the Dreadnought can shoot the Flamer because there is only 1 pink horror remaining. So screening your characters with smaller units could prove a bit different in 9th edition because you could soon shoot away the chaff and expose characters a little bit further down the shooting phase. Don't know what happened to this photo, it's got a bit blurry, apologies for that, but this is just showing that a character further forward than your squad is now the nearest visible target, so the Dreadnought can now shoot the Flamer. That's not changed from 8th edition. And again, not what's changed from 8th edition again is 2 characters, both of which are nearest to the Dreadnought. So I've got the Herald and the Flamer, both are characters under 9 wounds, both nearer than the pink horrors. Both characters are targetable, even though the Herald may be slightly nearer than the Flamer, but the Herald will not interfere with the Lookout Serval. So finally for this video then, I want to talk about a little bit more about obscuring, and is this going to make a big dent in the swing of the meta from shooting to melee. So I've already covered obscuring before, so anything 18 wounds or above behind a piece of 5-inch terrain is not obscured. Everything else can be obscured by the terrain, providing it has the obscured keyword. So does this make melee units a little bit good, or is this going to make it a little bit more challenging? Time will tell, but in this example here I've got a knight behind a piece of terrain. That terrain I've given the obscuring keyword. It's greater than 5 inches tall. I've got a unit of screamers behind it, behind the entire terrain feature. The knight cannot shoot or target those screamers. Now those screamers are really quite rapid with a 14-inch move. They can easily clear this obstacle because they also fly, and will then slam into the knight in combat. Combine that with an engine war ability for +1 to wound against vehicles, and they'll probably shred it. So yeah, and it's not got to worry too much because the Overwatch can't be activated either. So we're all going to be quite happy with that. Previous editions though, what you'd be doing is shooting through windows at the smallest little horn or bit of base or whatever that you could see before. So this view through the terrain, historically you'd have been able to be fine with, and you'd be able to shoot through that with Overwatch or with regular shooting. Now I'm going to be able to get my melee units a little bit closer to the enemy without fear of being shot off the board. Now I've always been a fan of the screamers. They have sucked for a while now because they never make it into combat because everyone shoots them. They've got a 50-50 4+ save and they just never make it. And I've got a funny feeling that a lot of other melee units are probably going to be happy with some of these obscuring rules and how this is going to work on the battlefield to get units closer to your opponent. So this Dreadnought's model eye view here, shooting through those windows would previously be fine. Now that unit cannot see the screamers at all in this particular position. What's going to be very key here is how you play and how you define your terrain. I've got a lot of my terrain mounted on 12-inch square bases because I think aesthetically it looks nice. It means they can butt up together and you can make larger pieces of terrain. And I would count the entire square potentially as a terrain feature. Just because I've got gaps around the edges just means it's more playable because you can put models on it and within it, rather than being super realistic with lots of masonry and fallen brickwork and rubble that you get on some very, very clever, very exceptionally inspiring diorama pieces. Terrain also has to be functional. You need to be able to move models in, vehicles through it, bikes through it, stuff with larger bases in and around it. For me, in my house, when I'll be playing any of my gaming buddies in the future, the rules are going to be the same for everybody. Every terrain feature will be on a 12-inch base. So for me, that is... It's not trying to... I don't think that's trying to take advantage of my terrain. I think that's just... Because it'll be the same for both sides. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter how you define it. But for me, I think that I've built my terrain in order to be gameable rather than necessarily look realistic. So if you can imagine this terrain feature that we're looking at right now, there'd be fallen masonry and extra oil barrels and everything else all kicking around those little edges, but you could never really place your models on there without them falling over and getting damaged and chipped. So I try and make my terrain as gameable and as practical as possible while still trying to look pretty cool on the battlefield. So if you are playing at home or with strangers in a local gaming store or tournament or just any other kind of event, defining the terrain and maybe even labelling it with some counters or something so there is no confusion later in the game, what is defensible, what is and all the other rules that I've completely forgotten right now. Yeah, defensible, breachable, obscuring, and all the other new rules that are coming out. Maybe some tokens are probably going to be the way to go to make sure that no one pulls a fast one or you forget yourself as you go through your games. I think that's going to be quite a key thing. But in general, I've got a funny feeling melee units, especially with this this change in board size or a minimum recommended board size, could see a swing in the meta from a very shooty edition of 8th to maybe a little bit more balance, where you're still going to need some decent fire support, but you're going to want some heavy hitters in your army as well. So there we go then, guys. A little breakdown discussion, in my opinion, whether melee forces are going to be the new hotness. So this has really been focused around my demon forces, because that is an army that I have an awful lot of infantry, a lot of melee-based troops, especially around those screamers, which I really love to use, but they are so bad in 8th edition. With the new terrain rules, with obscuring, with their speed, their impact, and the Overwatch decision that now has to be made by your opponent, is melee going to be the new thing, especially for melee elite troops, because if you're a big hoardy blob of orcs, for example, you're probably going to suffer from a lot of blast weapons. If you're a little bit smaller, a little bit compact, where you can make more choices and more advantage of the terrain and still have a little bit of extra wounds going around. Those screamers, for example, are 2 wounds, can still hide, but are not going to suffer the full wrath from a blast weapon. Is this going to be the new change? Combine that with table sizes that are shrinking a little bit as the recommended minimum guide now. Time will tell. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on 9th, like everyone else who is a 40k fan, I am sure, just to see how this pans out, especially if keeping an eye on the competitive scene, to see where they're going to be going with this and find out what happens next. But I'd love to hear from you in the comment section what you think of melee versus shooting as we head into 9th edition. Is shooting still going to be the strongest thing, or are the new changes that we're seeing so far, and I'm sure there are many more to come this week if it's not already come out by the time I've launched this video, and of course with the full rules hopefully by the end of July in our midst. But I'd love to hear from you in the comment section either way. But if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I shall catch you guys on the next video.